David, first of all, it's very hard to understand what exactly is in this Georgia law because it depends who's covering it. I've heard perspectives that are all over the map. Does that just show how all of this is being viewed through a very partisan lens?
I think that's exactly right, Katie. And there's also some other understandable reasons for it. First of all, obviously, we live in a really partisan environment, and Georgia just ran an incredibly successful election, like the rest of the country, the most secure and transparent election Georgia had ever seen. They literally counted their presidential ballots 3 times, 3 different ways. All their ballots are on paper for the first time in 2 decades. They previously were purely digital ballots. They couldn't have recounted or audited them. They ran a very, very good election this November. So the first thing we've got to recognize is that any legislation that was being considered was unnecessary. It was based on the big lie. It was based on the idea that there was something wrong with Georgia elections, when in fact, everything was right about Georgia elections. Georgia should be incredibly proud. Those laws were put in place by Republican legislatures, signed into law by Republican governors, and implemented by Republican secretaries of state.
Your position is this law was unnecessary, so no wonder people are criticizing it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, honestly, if we looked at how Georgia ran elections in 2020, and if every state ran elections like Georgia did, we'd be in pretty good shape. Voters in Georgia had ample access to mail ballots if they wanted them. They didn't need to show any excuse. It was very easy to get. They had ample access to early voting opportunities. Famously, the State Farm Arena, where the Atlanta Hawks play, had thousands of voters come and vote in a really safe environment where they can engage in social distancing. Georgia election officials knocked the ball out of the park. And they did a great job, and we should be congratulate them rather than trying to roll back some of the things that led to the success of 2020 and early 2021 in Georgia.
With all due respect, though, isn't there always room for improvement?
Sure. I mean, if we look at things, if we were really doing the legislative process right, we'd be looking at things that worked, things that could be improved upon, and see if we could tweak that. And of course, that should always be done in a bipartisan way. This shouldn't be done because we're trying to put the thumb on the scale for one party or another. And a great example of that actually is the state of Kentucky. The state of Kentucky had to change a lot of rules because of the pandemic. Temporarily, they made early voting more available. They made mail voting more available. And after the election, they looked at what worked and what didn't. The Democratic governor, the Republican secretary of state, the state board of elections, Republican and Democratic county election officials, and the legislators throughout the state got together, and they determined what would work best going forward. And they kept a lot of those access measures, things that were really good for voters, in place. And that bill passed the legislature nearly unanimously and was approved of both by Democrats and Republicans. That's the way to go about it. And that's certainly an appropriate way. That's not what we saw in Georgia or what we're seeing in other states.
In fact, you believe Major League Baseball should have moved the All-Star game to Kentucky to say, way to go, Kentucky.
So I want to be clear. I'm taking no position on whether the All-Star game should have been moved from Atlanta. I've been to that stadium. It's a beautiful stadium. I'm not suggesting that Major League Baseball either was right or wrong to move it. But once the decision to move it was made, I actually did advocate for it to be moved to Louisville. I thought that would have been a wonderful recognition of a state that actually made things a lot easier for voters, worked in a bipartisan way, and kept a lot of those provisions in place for future elections.
Let me get your reaction, David, to something that Gabe Sterling, a well-known Georgia election official, told me.
There's a lot of what I consider to be disinformation now about this particular bill, and that's being used to engage in, for lack of a better word, economic blackmail, because there's a political angle to be had. There's a political angle to be had in the disinformation around claiming election fraud. There's an angle to be had around claiming suppression on this side. And in the lawsuits that we've had with Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight over the last few years, we've done a lot of discovery. And in that, we found that they poll tested voter suppression. They went through focus groups and landed on that as their best way to try to get votes. And it's a very good model. It's a great way to raise money. It's a great way to get people psychologically attuned to, they're trying to steal your vote. The general human and American tendency is being, well, the hell they are, I'm going to go vote.
Gabe Sterling seems to say that Democrats are doing this to gain partisan advantage because it fires up voters and makes them come to the polls. What's your reaction to that?
So first of all, I know Gabe. Gabe is an outstanding election official in a state where it's really difficult because the margins are so narrow. And he is a Republican, and he is not shy in that. And the election officials in Georgia, whether they be Republicans or Democrats at the county level, have just been through a period of time of intense partisanship, where they're being criticized by both sides. There is no safe harbor for these public servants who are working really hard jobs with very little payoff at the end, either from the hard right, who has been spreading the lie of election fraud, or to be honest, the hard left as well, which has been criticizing them for perceived problems they've been having. And I can understand the challenges that they perceive and they're facing. I don't live in that political world. That's not what the work that I do. And the work that I do, and I've worked very closely with election officials in Georgia, has been to try to improve the system for voters and to ensure that they have maximum integrity while allowing for the maximum level of voter convenience as well. And Georgia had really achieved that in 2020 and early 21. They had done a remarkable job. There's no question there are partisan angles on this in a variety of ways. The facts are that the Georgia law was completely unnecessary, and it's a mixed bag. And one of the reasons I think there's so many mischaracterizations of it is there was initially a law that was introduced that was very, very bad for voters. It was based on a lot of probably intentional misunderstanding of how the system worked. It was going to severely roll back mail voting. It was going to roll back Georgia's very successful automatic voter registration system, which has led them to have some of the most complete and accurate voter lists in the country. And then very notably, it was going to outlaw Sunday early voting, which was seen as a particular attack on the historic and really important souls to the polls efforts that around African-American churches, where they take people to vote on Sundays after church services. None of those things were in the bill as it was finally. So that's probably led to some misconceptions, but there are still some really troubling things in the bill mixed in with some things that might not be so bad.
Let's talk about the really troubling things first.
So a great example of some of the troubling things, it makes it somewhat harder to get a mail ballot. There's severe limits on drop boxes as well. Drop boxes are a wonderful integrity measure, I should say. This is something that election professionals across the political spectrum agree on. When you have drop boxes for mail ballots, what you're effectively doing is eliminating the Postal Service as a middleman, where ballots could get lost even in a Postal Service working really, really well. It could take extra time. And when you have drop boxes, what you find in states that have a lot of them and a lot of mail voting is the majority of people actually use the drop boxes, and they take their voted ballot, deliver it to a drop box, and that means the only people that ever have a voted ballot are the legitimate voter and the election officials who should be counting that ballot. It never goes through the Postal Service or anything else. To see a severe limitation on drop boxes is not a really good idea.
And that's happening particularly in Atlanta with the heavy Black population, is it not?
It's happening in Atlanta, but I also want to say it's happening elsewhere. I mean, there's about a third of voters in Georgia voted by mail in this past election. That's probably going to be a high watermark for mail voting in the future. That was probably driven very heavily by the pandemic, but clearly they're going to see a significant number of Georgia voters voting by mail. And interestingly enough, historically, if you take 2020 aside and the unusual aspects of the pandemic, historically mail voters have tended to be older and they tended to be disproportionately white. And so they trended probably slightly Republican in the past. So these are all measures that could, if they're being done for political purposes by Republican majorities, they actually could end up shooting Republican election prospects in the foot.
Let's talk about the other troubling aspects. Are those the main two? It
makes it a little bit more difficult to get a mail ballot. Interestingly, the mail ballot process is also a mixed bag here. This law makes it harder to get a mail ballot in the first place, but I think there's a really good argument to be made that it makes it easier for that ballot to be counted once it gets in. So it's again a mixed bag, but to request a mail ballot, you need to show, you need to have some ID numbers in order to get a mail ballot in the first place. I think a couple of other things that it does, it allows unlimited challenges of voters, which could be abused by hyperpartisans. It also It also has some restrictions on the offering of provisional ballots. Provisional ballots are the ballots that are given to voters who, for some reason, something is wrong. Their voter record doesn't match up with the information. They're in the wrong polling place, and it's important when that happens to voters, they try to get to the right polling place so that their whole ballot will be counted. But if that can't happen, getting a provisional ballot can be really important because in some cases that ballot will count, and this puts some restrictions on that, which could be problematic.
I think a lot of people have the misconception that voter fraud happens frequently. The Hoover Institute did a study of this and found something like 15 cases of voter fraud with millions and millions of ballots cast. Can you give us some perspective on how often voter fraud even occurs?
Yeah, voter fraud is about as common as getting eaten by a shark while getting struck by lightning and winning the lotto. It's really, really rare. It does happen, but it's extremely rare. So for instance, this is not just liberal groups talking. The Heritage Foundation famously maintains a database that goes back over 40 years. And they themselves have only documented, with a very, very loose standard of what constitutes voter fraud, only about 1,000 cases out of literally billions of ballots cast during that period of time. The Bush DOJ did an investigation of voter fraud about 15 plus years ago, and they found virtually no cases. Famously, Trump's Commission on Election Integrity was disbanded because they couldn't find anything, and they couldn't find any evidence of voter fraud. And Republican and Democratic secretaries will tell you they do investigations of this all the time. Voter fraud, there's this myth that voter fraud is really hard to find, and that's why we don't have any evidence of it. I'm a former DOJ lawyer. I've literally litigated voting rights cases, election cases in federal courts. I can tell you as a federal prosecutor, voter fraud is one of the easiest things to find. It's a dream of a case for a prosecutor. There's tons of documentary evidence, there's signature evidence, there's eyewitness evidence because someone has physically presented themselves at the polls. There's a ton of evidence of these cases. It's very easy to prove. The fact of the matter is, why would an individual risk multiple years in prison, multiple thousands of dollars in fines, for the possibility that they might cast one extra ballot in an election in which 160 million ballots are cast? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's one of the many reasons we don't see much voter fraud, in addition to the very many checks and balances that voters don't understand are in place to make sure that the people who are casting ballots are the people who are supposed to be casting ballots. There are dozens of checks and balances in place in every state.
You're saying these cases are very easy to prove. They just don't happen that often.
That's right. And occasionally we'll see a case like this. We'll see cases where there was a case famously of a Republican voter in Florida who tried to move up to Georgia to register to vote and vote in the Senate runoff. That was caught immediately. These things are very easy to find. They're usually caught before the person can even cast a ballot. It is not the crime of the century. There are very few people who intend to commit voter fraud or would want to do that. We Americans take our democracy very seriously, but it's a really foolhardy crime in addition to that.
What's most disturbing about the Georgia law?
Yeah, so there are several provisions of the Georgia law that are unnecessary, that will likely hurt election integrity, and are disturbing because they might make it difficult for voters. One of the things that most concerns me is the severe restriction on drop boxes, which is going to harm election integrity because it's going to mean that voters have to use the Postal Service more rather than delivering their voted ballots directly to election officials. I mean, there are some other things, like it makes it a little bit harder to request a mail ballot. There are some restrictions on providing a provisional ballot. It allows individuals to make unlimited challenges to voters. And then there are the things that I think are really petty and ugly. And I don't know if they're going to have a huge impact on voters, but are a bad look for the state of Georgia. And those include things like stripping the Secretary of State of his chairmanship of the State Board of Elections, his voting membership on that board. He did an outstanding job, something we'd hope any of our public servants would do under this circumstance. And it seems petty to remove that power from someone who's a true public servant. And then secondly, of course, all of us know this, the prohibition, the criminalization of providing food and beverage to voters who are waiting in line within the 150-foot radius. Is this going to have much impact? Probably not. Is this even going to be enforced? I'm not sure. But why would you even do that? That is, when there are long lines, if it's hot out, if the weather's not great, if someone's getting tired, why would you make it a crime? Why would the state step in and make it a crime for another individual to hand someone a sandwich or a bottle of water?
I guess the argument is that some of these people were trying to encourage the people in line to get other people to vote, which is against the law, or they were wearing t-shirts, they were wearing MAGA hats, or they were wearing BLM t-shirts, and they were in a way pressuring some of these people in line. What about that? That shouldn't be allowed, should it?
Yeah, so first of all, we should recognize that there are already laws in place in Georgia and in pretty much every state that prohibit that kind of electioneering activity. Wearing of campaign t-shirts, actively advocating for votes for particular candidates or causes within the 150-foot threshold was already outlawed. And so that could be enforced. They could enforce that law. But secondly, we should also recognize these are people who are already in line. This is not incentivizing them to come out and vote. These are people who are already there and standing in line and waiting to express their preference. So it's entirely appropriate to enforce electioneering laws. Georgia already has them. Other states already have them. But the idea that you would, I mean, this is not just saying that this shouldn't be done. This was the criminalization of providing or receiving food or beverage while waiting in line within the 150-foot threshold. Again, I think this was a self-inflicted wound by the bill drafters. It didn't need to be in there. It makes the bill look very bad.
If the Secretary of State isn't overseeing the elections, who is, and will it fall into the hands of partisans?
So I'll say, first of all, the Georgia Secretary of State still has responsibilities to oversee the elections. He is just no longer, as Georgia is constructed, the State Board of Elections has rules as well, and he no longer is the chair and has a voting seat on that. But he still is a member of the State Board of Elections. I expect he'll still have significant influence. I don't know that we're going to see much change in how the State Board or the Georgia Secretary of State's office operates. But what I do think is this is very clearly some loyalty test to prove that Republicans in the state legislature were unhappy with the fact that their preferred candidate lost the state of Georgia.
I guess the question is, can state officials now overturn the will of the people in Georgia? Because I've heard talk of that.
I think the risk of that is very, very low, to be perfectly honest. The legislature will appoint people to the State Board of Elections. The State Board of Elections, before they can exercise their power to appoint a temporary conservator for any county's elections, there have to be multiple points of failure, multiple complaints raised about a particular county. And I do think it's an area where we're going to need to remain vigilant. It could be abused, but this is one of those things that if we see that the counties being targeted are only heavily minority counties or only heavily Democratic counties, we will know that months before an election, months before the election returns come in. And that's something that I would expect that advocates and activists should be vigilant about and will likely bring lawsuits about.
David, what does the Georgia law say about voter IDs? Because that seems to be such a sticking point between Republicans and Democrats. And I'd love for you to explain why this is such a contentious issue.
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to say, I think the voter ID provisions of this bill in particular, which are relatively minimal, have been misunderstood, probably by both sides. And what we should say is Georgia already has some voter ID requirements. Those remain in place for in-person voting. What is new in this bill is that voters, when they vote by mail and they vote a mail ballot, they are now going to be asked to put their driver's license number, or if they don't have a driver's license number, the last 4 digits of their social security number underneath the sealed flap of their mail ballot to be checked by election officials when it comes in. If those match, they never have to match the signature. So this is being done instead of the somewhat more subjective signature matching that goes on. This is very, very similar to what the state of Minnesota does with a great deal of success, where they have a driver's license number or a social on there instead of the signature that's being checked. And I should say that Georgia, because of this very successful automatic voter registration system that they have, which yields very high voter registration rates in the state, 97% of all Georgia voters have a driver's license number associated with their voter record in their voter record. And almost all of the rest have a last four of social associated with it. So it's very unlikely that that anyone's going to be disenfranchised by this. We should keep an eye on it and look at the data. And we should look and we might see actually even lower rejection rates for mail ballots, because signature matching is a little more subjective than just checking a driver's license number against the database. We'll keep a close eye on this, but if it's been as successful as we've seen it in a place like Minnesota, this could actually be one of the good things about the bill.
What's wrong with asking for an ID? A lot of people complain about that. They say elderly people may have expired driver's license, or they may not have their stuff together and not be able to remember things. So what are the best arguments for and against voter IDs?
So as with everything in elections, we're trying to balance out access with integrity. It's a constant balance. There's nothing that's just all integrity or all access. If we wanted to make voting just about access and we didn't care about the integrity, we could say just text your vote to a certain number. That has no integrity whatsoever, but it'd be very accessible. If we wanted to say it was all about integrity and not access, we could build a concrete monolith that people have to physically go to and give a blood test or a DNA sample and vote, but that doesn't make sense either. So we've balanced this in all of our considerations. And what we know is that voter impersonation fraud is extremely rare, almost non-existent in any way. We also know that not everyone has an ID. And for some people, getting an ID is really hard. They might not have their birth certificate. They might not have citizenship documentation. They might have lost it, or there are older voters in particular who might have been born with the assistance of midwives. We've heard this a lot in a lot of places where they don't have easy access to birth certificates or adequate ID. So getting an ID can be really hard. And so you have to take a really hard look and balance these things out and try to figure out, are there voters who are eligible who are going to be excluded from the process because of this ID requirement? And if so, is it balanced out by a need for integrity? And that need for integrity is very low because people are not impersonating other voters. All that said, there are ways to validate identity, whether it's through mail balloting or even in-person voting, that don't require the showing of documentation. It's interesting right now to hear a lot of the same people who are arguing for very rigid voter ID laws that could disenfranchise some voters argue against something like a vaccine passport, which would keep other people healthy around them. So a lot of these arguments are somewhat convenient. Where I come out is, are we balancing access with integrity appropriately? And there are states, for instance, Michigan is a good example, where they have an ID requirement, but if you don't have the ID, you can simply fill out an affidavit that attests you are who you say you are. And very few people need to use those. But then if they want to investigate those affidavits for potential fraud, they've got a very small stack of things that they can investigate, documentary evidence, and they can find the fraud if it exists. And there never is fraud from those investigations. There are ways to balance access with integrity. It is not wrong to say we want to make sure only eligible voters are voting, but it's also not wrong to say we want to make sure all eligible voters can vote easily. What does the Georgia law do well? Well, I think this ID requirement might be one of the things that it does well, replacing the driver's license number or SS4 for the signature. I also think it expands early voting. It does expand the hours. Georgia already had ample early voting. A lot has been made of the fact that it requires 2 Saturdays, but it makes the 2 Sundays optional. I am 100% confident that in large counties, particularly with large minority communities, that those counties will have ample Sunday voting opportunities. There is no way Fulton County, which is going to be the county, these counties are the ones that have the power to make this decision. I have no doubt Fulton County is going to allow for very robust voting opportunities on Sunday for anyone who wants to make use of them, including those who are going souls to the polls. Before we move to Texas, which I know you're super concerned about, what about the corporate pressure being exerted upon Georgia? Do you think it's important for election integrity that these corporations take a stand? I know that you're not speaking one way or another, but what about the effectiveness? So I think we'll have to wait and see. I think it's interesting that for many, many years, primarily Republicans and conservatives have argued that corporations are citizens, that they're entitled to First Amendment rights, that those First Amendment rights include, for instance, ample opportunity to donate to political movements and to candidates. And that argument has held the day in cases like Citizens United in the Supreme Court. But we can't only defend free speech when we agree with it. Free speech means we have to defend it when we don't agree with it as well. And you might not like what our corporate citizens are saying right now, but I think it's valuable when corporate citizens stand up and stand up for democracy, stand up against things that they view as anti-democratic and that hurt voters. And there are going to be people who disagree with them on policy reasons, but we should be able to have that disagreement and not say you should only speak when I like what you happen to be saying.
According to the Brennan Center, 47 states are reassessing right now their election laws. Does that worry you?
Well, there are a lot of states that are considering election law changes right now. Not all of them are for bad reasons or based on a lie. As I mentioned, Kentucky did it for a very good reason. There have been some very positive proposals in states like Michigan that the Secretary of State there and county election officials of both parties have tried to move forward. But there are several states, I don't know the exact number where troubling laws have been introduced or where they might be likely to pass, but I've been keeping a close eye on some election proposals being made in not only Georgia, but also Texas, Arizona, and Florida, and to some degree Michigan as well, where there are efforts by legislatures where there appear to be majorities who have been complicit in spreading the lie about a stolen election, who are proposing things that actually roll back a lot of the reasons that the 2020 election cycle was such a success. We should also be careful. A lot of those bills are being proposed in states where those bills are never going to move. The advocates for those proposals don't have close to majorities. So I don't think we need to worry about a bill like that moving in, say, the state of California, for instance. But the fact that there is this widespread, pervasive lie about the election in 2020, and that legislators are pushing proposals based on that lie should concern us, and we've got to remain vigilant about that.
What is the most egregious example of the states that you're concerned about?
I don't think it's even close. It's Texas. I mean, Texas, a bill just moved through the Texas Senate. It's called SB 7 that is based on a completely unrealistic version of what happened in Texas in 2020. And it's really important to note, Texas was already one of the hardest states to vote in the country. It was really hard to vote by mail. It was really hard to vote early. It has an ID requirement. It also was one of the least secure states in the country. It is one of the only states left that doesn't require paper, auditable, recountable ballots throughout the state. And there are significant numbers of ballots that are not recountable, are not auditable in the state of Texas. Rather than address those concerns, it appears the Texas legislature right now is focused more on this fantasy that there was fraud in the 2020 election. There was unprecedented turnout in Texas in 2020. Election officials at the county level had to demonstrate remarkable ingenuity, particularly because, unlike a state like Georgia or Florida or Arizona, it was hard for voters to have a convenient way to vote. There was not easy access to mail ballots in Texas. There was not easy access to early voting. And so places like Harris County figured out ways to offer more drop boxes and to have drive-through voting and to offer 24-hour voting, things that were designed to mitigate the effect of Texas's restrictive laws. Election officials in other states didn't need to come up with measures like that because a voter in Georgia had pretty easy access to the ballot in 2020. Same with Florida, same with Arizona. So Texas is already starting way behind other states. And now it's passing laws that are going to make it harder to vote by mail, make it harder to vote early, restricting local election officials' ability to offer voters convenient voting options. And then there are a couple of things that I just can't believe got into a bill that passed a state legislature. For instance, voters with disabilities who need to vote by mail because of their disability now have to go and get a doctor's note. In other words, if they want to avoid having to leave the house to go to their polling place to vote, they have to leave their house and go to their doctor's office to get a note to vote by mail. I'm not sure that that's legal. It's certainly going to be challenged, and it's really troubling. The other thing that I'm really concerned about is the Texas law would empower partisan poll watchers to essentially roam around the polling place wherever they want to go, potentially interfering with the work of election officials. And partisan poll watchers, and only partisan poll watchers, would have that power, and have the power to use a wireless device like a cell phone to literally video voters who are voting if they think something is potentially fishy. And that could be very intimidating. I mean, if you ask most voters if they'd like to be recorded or even live streamed as they're voting, I'm sure most would say absolutely not. And that's currently in the Texas SB 7 that's now gone to the Texas House.
Is this purely political, what's happening in Texas?
You know, I try not to get into the mindset of people who are passing laws like this. Here's what I can tell you. There is no legitimate justification for any of these laws. There is no evidence of fraud or integrity problems that would justify it. And in fact, even with the lack of paper ballots in Texas, this law would delay the rollout of a paper ballot requirement until 2026, meaning Texas would likely be the only state in the 2024 election that offers any kind of paperless voting, unrecountable voting in the entire nation. So this bill would actually harm election security and integrity while making it harder to vote. So it's very hard to perceive what possible justification there could be for it.
There's a school of thought that Republicans believe they can't win when there's high voter turnout. So do you think some of the laws that are unfolding in these states are an intentional effort to reduce turnout?
So it's hard for me to say what the intent behind these laws are because I can't conceive of any, but I will say this. It has been an article of faith among both Republicans and Democrats for some time that higher turnout always benefits Democrats. And that is a myth. And it's a somewhat lazy myth, quite frankly. The data does not support that. If you look at states like Ohio, Iowa, Florida, Texas, they all made voting easier than it had ever been in those states, even Texas with the very low bar it was already at. They all saw by far the highest turnout they had ever seen. And in every one of those states, Republicans won, in some cases by record margins. I mean, Republicans won the state of Florida in 2020 by the largest margin they had seen in a decade. And so I just don't know where this belief comes from. I can tell you that it's anytime you try to game the system as a legislature and fix the rules so that your party has a better chance 2, 4, 6 years down the line, almost every time those efforts fail. They're not just anti-democratic to do that kind of thing. Those efforts fail because it's the voting population, the electorate, is a very complex entity. They're moved by a lot of different forces. And you just never know what's going to happen. In the last 6 years, 7 years, we have seen both the lowest turnout in a federal election since World War II and the highest turnout in an American election in US history. I mean, we've got a lot of factors working on that, but gaming the system is not going to guarantee a party victory and a raging success. That's what we should be shooting for in American democracy. When we can boost turnout, when we can have participation and engagement by the electorate, regardless of the outcome. This is why people like Secretary Raffensperger in Georgia, Secretary Sagatsky, another Republican in Nevada, Democrats like Secretary Hobbs in Arizona and Secretary Benson in Michigan, all of whom enacted and implemented policies that led to unprecedented turnout and integrity in their states. They are national heroes. We should be throwing, as soon as we all get vaccinated, we should throw a parade for election officials. These people did this all, and they did it during a global pandemic. It's remarkable.
And under incredible pressure from the President of the United States.
Yes, and his supporters. I mean, we've never had the White House itself using its platform and megaphone to delegitimize American democracy as we did. And it wasn't just in 2020, and it wasn't just after the election. I mean, even candidate Trump was doing this in the summer of 2016 and did it shortly after his inauguration. It creates huge challenges The supporters who've listened to that and believe it are victims, and I feel sorry for people who've been led astray by this. It's usually because people like the president are trying to raise money, and we've seen a lot of evidence of that. It's going to be something we're going to need to work towards for a long time. But in the meantime, what we've seen is election officials not just working under the stress of having the president criticize them or call them and threaten them, as we saw in Georgia, but death threats were common amongst election officials. I know of at least a dozen who shared their death threats with me, who were under police protection. This was not just Democrats, it was not just Republicans. There were many in Georgia, there were many in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Arizona, and we could go down the list of people who not only their own lives were threatened, but also their families. I was talking to an election official who had to cut off a call because her house was literally under siege by protesters, her home where her 4-year-old son was. These people are not well paid. They don't get famous. And for the past several months, and for some it's still not over, they're receiving threats.
Do you believe H.R. 1, the Democrats' signature legislation on voting rights, would improve voting rights in this country?
So I think there's a lot of good things in the bill, and there's just a lot of things in the bill. It's a very, very big bill, about 800 pages. And the motivation behind it is excellent. And as with every bill, you know, if I had a magic wand, I might tweak some things here and there. But overall, what it tries to do is very good. And it takes a lot of good ideas from the states that are already in place. That said, I think we also have to recognize it is facing a very steep challenge to get passed in the Senate. And there's been a lot of talk about the filibuster, but it's not entirely clear that it's close to 50 votes, let alone 60. So first, there needs to be evidence that there are 50 firm votes. And it looks like right now, given Senator Manchin's statement, that there are not 50 votes. And it is perceived to be a very partisan effort. I do think what we're seeing in the states, though, is showing that we might have some need to raise the floor for federal elections to prevent some of the efforts we're seeing, that the anti-democratic efforts we're seeing in some of the states, at least for federal elections. And again, the model for this would be a lot of states where Republicans are in control. Ohio runs very, very good elections. Florida runs very, very good elections. Iowa runs really good elections. Georgia runs really good elections. Every single one of those states, the laws were passed by Republican legislatures. They were signed by Republican governors. They were implemented by Republican secretaries of state. So, you know, I think there are a lot of lessons to be taken. It's not like all of the Democratic states are running perfect elections either. And there are some things that a lot of the bluer states are going to have to look at to try to improve their elections as well. And certainly, the H.R. 1, the For the People Act, would put some significant pressures on some of the bluer states as well.
Do you think, philosophically though, how do you feel about federal election laws overriding state election laws or giving them some benchmark?
So I think there's a balance between federalization and federalism, and I think I think a floor is a really good idea for federal elections. By the way, we already have that. Things like the National Voter Registration Act, known as the Motor Voter Law, the Help America Vote Act, and to a large degree, the Voting Rights Act is that as well. Even though Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance provisions are no longer enforceable, thanks to a decision that the Supreme Court came down with about 8 years ago. That's a really important moderating force on the states. Two other things really quickly. First, we have to recognize that a lot of the really good ideas about elections have percolated up from the states. They haven't been pushed out from Washington. Ideas like online voter registration, automatic voter registration, paper ballots, mail voting, early voting, those all came from ingenious election officials in the states who first adopted them. And we should be learning from that. Secondly, I think one of the things that from a federal perspective would be really productive and helpful is while we're talking so much about H.R. 1, there's another bill that was proposed in the last Congress, H.R. 4 at the time, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And that would reestablish a coverage formula for Section 5 to basically recover certain states as needing preclearance for any voting change, they would predominantly be in the Deep South. A lot of them would be states that were previously covered, and it would likely be constitutional given the consideration raised in the previous case. That would be a wonderful first step towards establishing the right balance between the federal government's authority and the really great tradition we have of state authority in this area.